A chance encounter at the club. Part 1. The night begins. The apartment was quiet. The soft glow of the desk lamp barely lit the room, and outside, night had long since fallen. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, nervously tapping her fingers on her phone screen. She had just received a reminder from her friend about tonight. They were going to a club. Her husband John was away on a business trip, and it seemed like nothing could stop her from having a fun night, free from the usual worries. She gazed at her reflection in the mirror for a long time. Dark, glossy waves of hair cascaded over her shoulders, framing a face with large, slightly mischievous eyes. Bright red lipstick made her already alluring lips even more irresistible. Emily knew she attracted attention whenever she was out, and tonight she wasn't planning to fade into the background. Her black, form-fitting dress clung to every curve, her slim waist, rounded hips, and full chest. She felt almost too sexy, but that only fueled her desire to go somewhere loud and lively. Her phone buzzed again. It wasn't John. Mike's name flashed on the screen. She smiled, a flutter of excitement rising in her chest. Mike, the man who had been on her mind far too often lately. He was a colleague, but their relationship had long outgrown the boundaries of work. Light flirtations, double-edged jokes, and glances that lingered just a little too long. All of it built an undeniable tension between them. And tonight, with John far away and the promise of temptation ahead, Emily decided to let herself indulge in thoughts she'd been suppressing for a while. She exhaled slowly, replying to Mike with a short but loaded message. "See you tonight." His response came almost immediately. "Can't wait." Emily gave herself one last look in the mirror, grabbed her clutch, slipped into her heels, and confidently stepped out of the apartment. Sitting in the taxi, listening to the music on the radio and watching the city lights blur past, her thoughts swirled chaotically. She knew playing with fire was dangerous, but the risk only thrilled her more. Her heart raced as they neared the club. The loud music hit her before she even stepped inside. Lights flashed, casting bright streaks across the crowd of dancers. Faces, laughter, and motion blurred together around her. Emily felt the night's energy wrap around her like a cloak. She quickly found her friends, but thoughts of Mike lurking somewhere nearby wouldn't leave her alone. When their eyes met across the crowd, the world seemed to stop. His tall, lean figure stood out against the mass of dancers. He looked at her in a way no other man had ever looked at her before. His gaze was filled with desire, and Emily felt her body respond to it. She moved closer to him. Music pounded around them, lights flickered, and their figures seemed to blur into the chaos. She allowed herself a soft smile, brushing her hand against his, and felt a spark leap between them. Her friends were nearby, but she could no longer hear their voices. It was just Mike, his warmth, and the wild rhythm of the music as they began to move together. The first dance was almost innocent. They laughed, whispered to each other, as if they could still pretend there was nothing serious between them. But every touch of his body against hers ignited a fire inside Emily. Mike wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her closer, and she pressed back just as eagerly. Their movements grew bolder, as the music pushed them like predators cornered by their own passion. At some point, Emily realized she no longer cared what anyone thought. This night was hers, and his. And no matter what happened later, right now, neither of them could stop. Part 2. Closer together. The dance floor filled with new faces, but for Emily, none of it mattered anymore. All her attention was locked on Mike. With each movement, their bodies seemed to pull closer, the space between them shrinking. The club lights played across his face, but all she felt was his firm grip on her waist, leaving her no chance to pull away. "I didn't think you'd come," Mike whispered, leaning close to her ear. His voice was barely audible over the booming music, but Emily caught every word. She smiled, tilting her head back, her dark wavy hair falling loosely over her shoulders. Mike's gaze lingered on her lips, and in that moment, Emily felt his hand slide higher up her back. She gave him a brief, meaningful look, her eyes glinting in the neon lights, lips parting in a teasing smile. "I couldn't miss this," she replied, tracing the outline of his arm with her finger. Another track began, slower and more sultry. Around them, people swayed gently to the rhythm, but Emily was only aware of what was happening right in front of her. She felt Mike pull her even closer. Their bodies moved in sync, as if the music wasn't just driving their dance, but urging them to cross lines that once seemed untouchable. The tension between them grew with every passing second. His breath was faint, but she could feel it against the skin of her neck. She leaned in, expecting him to speak, but instead heard only his quiet, raspy exhale as his lips brushed her shoulder. "You're incredible tonight," Mike murmured, his hand sliding down from her waist to her thigh. His fingers seared her through the thin fabric of her dress. A shiver ran through Emily's body. Every touch from Mike sent waves of heat through her, clouding her mind. He was so close, so unbearably close, that thoughts of her husband John, away on a business trip, began to fade into something distant and unreal. A heady mix of alcohol, loud music, and flirting created a perfect storm, drowning her in the moment. She couldn't think of anything but Mike, his hands pulling her tighter against him. His movements were sharp yet deliberate, as though he knew exactly what she wanted, and she loved how fast everything was happening. They weren't dancing anymore. Their bodies still swayed to the music, but it was less a dance and more an irresistible attraction pulling them together. Mike drew her so close their lips were only inches apart. Her heart raced, and she held her breath, waiting for his next move. "Let's get out of here." His voice was low, urgent, as if he couldn't wait any longer. Emily didn't reply. She met his gaze, nodded slowly, her body making the decision for her. She grabbed her purse and intertwined her fingers with his, pulling Mike through the crowd. They stepped outside, where the cool, fresh air hit her face, bringing a brief moment of clarity. But it wasn't enough to make her stop. Mike was beside her, his presence leaving no room for second thoughts. Their steps quickened, purposeful, until they reached the nearest hotel. The moment they were inside, Mike pulled her to him. Their lips finally met, and all the tension that had been building between them for months erupted in a surge of passion. There were no more words. Everything had already been decided. He pressed her against the wall, his hands roaming over her body with a hunger she matched, surrendering completely to the moment. This was no longer just flirtation, it was the inevitable conclusion of their game. When they reached the room, Emily let go of the last remnants of doubt. She had already crossed the line, and now every breath, every glance, belonged to this moment. Their kisses were hot, frantic, as if they didn't have enough time. Her hands wandered over his body, feeling the tension in his muscles, his breathing becoming more ragged. They spent the night wrapped in passion, every moment feeling perfect. Emily felt alive, as if this was the adventure she'd been missing for years. But somewhere in the back of her mind, for just a fleeting second, a thought of John flickered, a quiet reminder that this night would change everything. When they finally fell asleep, tangled together, Emily could still feel the faint echo of her excitement, and her guilt. Morning came, and she was the first to wake. The quiet of the room was starkly different from the pounding music of the club. Mike slept beside her, his hand resting on her hip, and outside, the first light of dawn was breaking. Emily quietly got up, reaching for her phone to check her messages. She wanted to send Mike a message, something full of gratitude and emotion, but her fingers slipped, and she accidentally sent it to John instead. It was incredible. "Can't wait for more." Her heart stopped. She immediately deleted the message, praying he hadn't seen it. But she wasn't sure. Part 3. A disturbing morning. Emily stood frozen, staring at her phone's screen. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst out of her chest. John's name flashed before her eyes, beneath the message she had sent. It was incredible. "Can't wait for more." The words burned inside her. She had deleted the message instantly, But the damage might already have been done. He could have seen it, but she didn't know for sure. Her phone remained silent, as though the entire world was holding its breath along with her. A whirlwind of thoughts spun through her mind. What if John already knows? What if he read the message and now understands everything about her betrayal? Or maybe he hasn't opened it yet. The uncertainty gnawed at her, driving her into panic. Outside, the first rays of sunlight began creeping through the curtains, a reminder that reality was waiting. But with Mike still peacefully asleep, Emily felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, where one wrong step could send her plummeting. She sat down on the bed, taking a deep breath. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself. "Maybe he didn't see anything. Maybe it's just a mistake, and you can pretend like nothing happened." But deep down, a voice kept whispering, "You've gone too far." Emily knew she had to get out of here as fast as possible. She glanced at Mike, who was still soundly asleep, his face relaxed, as if last night had no bearing on anything important. He had no idea about the storm raging inside her, the possibility that her life could be unraveling at this very moment. She felt a brief flash of envy. He was free from this anxiety. Quietly, she dressed, trying not to wake him. Her mind raced with plans. She needed to leave before John called or anyone else reached out. As she reached for the door, her phone buzzed in her hand. Emily froze. John's name appeared on the screen. For a moment, she couldn't bring herself to either answer or decline the call. This was the moment of truth, or the end of everything. But her hand finally moved, and she pressed the button to pick up. "Hey, honey," came John's familiar voice from the other end of the line. It was calm, steady, but that only made Emily's anxiety worse. "I just wanted to let you know that I might be coming home earlier than planned. Tomorrow morning, actually." Emily swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. Her heart still raced and her thoughts were jumbled. He didn't mention the message, so maybe he hasn't seen it, she thought. "Oh, really?" she replied, her voice tense, though she forced a casual tone. "I'll be waiting." "Everything all right with you?" John asked, his tone still calm, though Emily detected a slight note of tension in his voice. Yes, everything's great," she said, forcing a smile even though he couldn't see it. They talked a little more, but John never brought up anything unusual. He said he had to head to a meeting and ended the call with, "I love you." When the conversation ended, Emily slowly set her phone down on the bed. She was confused, her mind tangled with doubt. What if John had seen the message but chose to stay silent? Or maybe he had just overlooked it. Emily realized she had to get home, clear her head, and figure out how to handle the situation. But for now, she needed to keep calm and not let anything slip. She left the hotel room feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The night had been an emotional roller coaster, and her thoughts were like blurry footprints on wet sand. With each step, the anxiety grew, and by the time she got into the taxi, she was barely holding it together. As the taxi sped towards her apartment, she couldn't focus. Her entire energy was devoted to suppressing her nerves and not breaking down. The memories of last night's club scene flickered in and out of her mind, but they felt distant, unreal. Now, the only thing that mattered was the mistake, the fear, and John. When Emily finally stepped into her apartment, the familiar silence greeted her. She collapsed onto the couch, her thoughts racing. Her phone remained silent, and that brought a slight relief. But the sense of danger lingered, ever present. She glanced at the clock. John would be back tomorrow morning, which meant she had some time to think, to figure out her next move. Her heart still beat unevenly, and her thoughts swirled around the same question. How was she supposed to continue living after this? After thinking for a while, she decided to text Mike. "I need some time to process everything. Last night was amazing, but I'm not sure what comes next." She hoped he would understand and not push her. Emily reached for her phone but hadn't yet sent the message when she saw a new notification pop up. It was from Mike. "Everything okay? You left so suddenly." A fresh wave of guilt washed over her. The night had been incredible, but the consequences were already starting to unravel her world. She didn't know what to say, so she closed her screen and decided she would respond later. The evening dragged on, every hour feeling endless. Emily checked her phone constantly, but there were no new messages from John. This didn't calm her though, it only heightened her fear. Maybe tomorrow everything would come to light, and she would have to face the consequences head-on. For now, the affair remained her secret, but the question of what would happen next loomed large and unanswered. Part 4. Premonition of Trouble. Evening smoothly transitioned into night. But although Emily was home, her thoughts were far away, somewhere between the club, the hotel, and that fateful message to John. She lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to find peace. The fear that her husband had seen the message gradually turned into something more, a troubling premonition that her exposure was inevitable. Several hours had passed since John called her, and still there was no sign of suspicion from him. He spoke to her as always, lovingly and gently, which only amplified her guilt. Emily knew she had to explain what had happened to herself, how she ended up in bed with Mike, why she took that step. Her phone vibrated, interrupting her obsessive thoughts. It was a message from Mike. "How are you? You seemed tense when you left." Emily sighed. Her tension only grew after this question. He was trying to figure out what was going on, but she couldn't answer honestly. In her mind, a wall was already forming between them, built from guilt and fear of the consequences. She wanted to reply that everything was fine, that it was just one night, that she wasn't going to destroy her family for the passion that had flared up between them. But instead, she just put the phone aside and closed her eyes. Sleep never came, and her thoughts kept drifting back to the club. The next day was quiet, almost empty. Emily tried to distract herself with daily tasks, but the feeling that something was looming didn't leave her for a second. The phone remained silent. John was due to return in a few hours, and her internal dialogue became unbearable. What if he saw it? What if he's just waiting to confront me face to face? She decided to go outside to clear her head. Her footsteps echoed loudly in the empty corridors of the house, and this silence, instead of calming her, only intensified her anxiety. When she stepped outside, the sharp wind cooled her face but not her thoughts. Emily walked slowly down the street, trying to remember when exactly her relationship with John had become so routine that she started looking for something on the side. Their marriage wasn't unhappy, but it lacked the passion she had felt with Mike. It was a long process, gradually turning them into housemates rather than lovers. She remembered how a few years ago she and John could spend evenings together without leaving each other's side. How they could sit in a restaurant, and she felt that her husband looked at her with admiration. Those moments were gone now. And maybe that's why she had the urge to experience something new, something forbidden. Her phone vibrated again, and this time Emily immediately looked at the screen, expecting it to be John. But it was Mike again. "I miss you. Let's meet tonight." Emily felt a wave of anxiety rise inside her. She couldn't ignore him forever, but continuing this was impossible too. Now she had to make a decision. What would happen to her life next? Gathering her thoughts, she typed a short message. "I need time. I'm not ready to meet again." She knew this wasn't entirely honest since the reason for her hesitation went much deeper than just needing a break. But for now, it was important to her to maintain control of the situation. Mike replied almost immediately. "I understand, but I'll wait if you change your mind." Emily sighed and put the phone in her bag. A storm of emotions was still raging inside her. It felt like everything around her was about to collapse. By the time John returned, Emily was ready. She sat in the living room, deep in thought but trying to appear as calm as possible. As soon as the door opened, she stood up, and her heart began to beat faster again. This was the moment of truth. John entered the apartment, tired after the long trip but smiling. He approached her, kissed her on the cheek, and didn't seem to notice her tension. Emily felt a slight sense of relief, but only for a moment. She still didn't know if he had seen that message. "How are you? How was your trip?" she asked, trying to sound as natural as possible. Her voice sounded a little higher than usual, but John didn't seem to notice. "Everything was great. I'm a bit tired, but glad to be back," he replied, and headed to the bedroom to unpack. Emily followed him. Every step he took, every glance made her feel like she was on the brink of being exposed. John was acting completely normal, and this was both frightening and reassuring at the same time. He hadn't asked about the message or anything that might reveal his suspicions. Maybe he really hadn't seen it? However, just as she exhaled, John suddenly stopped and looked at her a bit more closely. "You look a little off," he said. "Is everything okay?" Emily felt her heart pound. She knew that if she slipped up now, everything would be lost. "Yes, I'm just a bit tired," she replied, trying to smile. "Work was stressful while you were away." He paused for a second, as if evaluating her words, then simply nodded and continued with his tasks. Emily, meanwhile, felt a slight tremble in her hands and legs. It had been too close, too dangerous. They spent the evening together, having dinner and discussing the usual everyday matters. But the feeling that everything could fall apart at any moment didn't leave Emily for a second. John didn't bring up any suspicious topics, and this worried her even more than if he had started asking questions. The night passed quietly, but for Emily, it was only the calm before the storm. She knew something had to happen, that it couldn't just end like this. Coincidences usually lead to consequences, and soon those consequences would catch up with her. The next day, when John had already gone to work, Emily stayed home alone. She checked her phone every few minutes, but there were no new messages from Mike. This gave her a sense of relief. Perhaps he understood that they needed a pause and wouldn't push. But by the evening, everything changed. She received a message from one of her friends. "Are you okay? We saw you at the club yesterday. You were with some guy." Emily froze, feeling panic rise in her chest. Friends? At the club? They had seen her. But the most terrifying thought wasn't this. An awful suspicion flashed through her mind. What if it wasn't just her friends? What if it was John? Part 5. The deception begins to unravel. The message from her friend struck Emily's mind like a knife, slicing through the thin thread of her already fragile composure. "You were with some guy." Those words echoed in her head over and over. How could they have seen her? And if they did, who else was in the club? What if John already knew? Her hands trembled as she started typing a reply. It was a misunderstanding. Just a friend. She wasn't sure these words would sound convincing, but it was the only way she could try to maintain control of the situation. She couldn't let rumors reach John, at least not yet. After sending the message, she sat on the couch gripping her phone, unsuccessfully trying to quell the fear creeping into every cell of her body. Everything she had done over the past few days suddenly felt on the verge of being exposed. The meeting with Mike, her secret thoughts, those moments of passion that seemed so exhilarating that night, were now turning into a destructive chaos. The day passed in anxiety, and in the evening, when John came home from work, Emily barely managed to put on a semblance of normality. They talked about everyday things, had dinner, but her thoughts were far away, flooded with fears and suspicions. John seemed calm, even a bit tired after work, but there were no hints in his eyes that he suspected anything. However, Emily noticed every little thing, how he looked at her, how his gaze occasionally lingered just a bit longer than usual. Those seconds felt like hours, and with each passing moment, her fear grew. At some point during dinner, John suddenly looked at her with curiosity. "You seem tense," he said. "Is something wrong?" Emily felt herself tighten inside. She couldn't allow him to suspect anything now when everything was hanging by a thread. "Just a bit tired lately," she replied, trying to smile. "A lot of work and no time for myself." John nodded, but his gaze didn't become any less suspicious. Emily felt that something had changed between them. Maybe he didn't know the truth, but he sensed something, and that feeling sparked a growing panic inside her. That night, Emily couldn't sleep again. She tossed and turned in bed, trying not to wake John. But her thoughts kept circling around the same question. What if this is the end? What if he knows? Her phone vibrated again. She turned on her side, careful not to wake her husband, and quickly checked the message. It was Mike again. Emily, I need to talk to you. You've been avoiding me all day. If you don't want to continue, just say so. His words made her freeze. Mike was right. She had been avoiding him, hoping it would give her time to figure herself out, and the disaster she had gotten into. But now she realized she had to make a decision. She stared at the phone screen for a long time, trying to figure out what to say to him. All the feelings she had for Mike were mixed with her fear of being caught. It seemed to her that if she continued her relationship with him, it would destroy everything she had with John. But she couldn't just end it easily, because Mike had become more to her than just a fling. Her fingers slowly began to type a message. Mike, I need time. I don't know what to do next. She sent the message and placed the phone on the nightstand, feeling her heart still pounding heavily. She realized this wasn't the end but merely the beginning of an even more difficult phase. She couldn't go back, but moving forward wasn't an easy decision either. The next day, Emily greeted John with a cold smile, which was becoming harder and harder to muster. She waited for him to ask her something, to hint at his suspicions, but he remained as usual, loving and attentive. This contrast between her inner fears and his outward calm was weighing on her more and more. At some point, while they were sitting on the couch watching TV, John suddenly spoke. Is there something you want to tell me? These words struck Emily like lightning. She froze, feeling all the sounds around her suddenly dull, and only the echo of his words echoed in her mind. She forced herself to look him in the eye. What do you mean? Her voice was too quiet, and she immediately realized it gave her away. John looked at her intently, as if studying her face. It just seems like you've been a little different lately, he said. You talk less, seem more nervous. Maybe something's going on, and you don't want to tell me. Emily felt the panic rise in her chest again. She tried to gather her thoughts, trying to figure out what to say without giving herself away completely. No, nothing like that, she finally replied, trying to smile. Just a lot going on. John lingered on her face for a moment, then nodded and turned back to the TV. That moment felt like an eternity to her. She didn't know if he believed her words or just decided not to bring up the subject for now. Emily felt everything around her beginning to fall apart. She could no longer ignore the signs that her deception was close to being exposed. When John left for work, Emily tried to distract herself, but her thoughts kept returning to the conversation. Her entire life was on the edge, and that feeling wouldn't let her go for a moment. She stared at her phone, waiting for new messages from Mike, but nothing came. Maybe he had decided to give her space, but that didn't make the situation any easier. Emily knew she had to make a choice. She couldn't keep living in this double reality. Her mind kept going back to the moment when she sent that fateful message to John. Maybe it was her chance, a chance to confess everything and start over, but the fear of the consequences paralyzed her. The entire day she spent in torturous thoughts. What to do next? Confess to John? End it with Mike? Or keep living, hoping that everything would somehow resolve itself? In the evening, she decided to go back to the club. She needed to feel that atmosphere again, where it all began. Maybe it would help her make a decision. Her friends suggested meeting up again, and she agreed, although she wasn't sure it was the right choice. The club greeted her with its usual thundering music and bright lights. Everything around seemed the same as that night. But this time, Emily felt different. Her inner tension grew with every minute, and she knew she couldn't stay in this environment for long. She danced, trying to relax, but with each movement, it felt like someone was watching her. She kept looking around, expecting to see a familiar face, Mike, or, even worse, John. The music pounded in her ears, the bass reverberated in her chest, and the tension only grew stronger. And suddenly, in one of the bright flashes of light, she saw him. John was standing at the bar. His eyes were already fixed on her. Emily froze, realizing there was no way to disappear unnoticed now. Part 6. A look that changes everything. The moment Emily locked eyes with John, her breath caught. Everything around her seemed to stop. Music, the roar of voices, dancing, and the bright flashes of light, all of it faded into the background. Her mind tried to make sense of what was happening, but the only thing she felt was rising fear. Her heart pounded in her chest so loudly, it seemed like the beats could be heard over the music. John stood by the bar motionless, but his gaze was fixed directly on her. He appeared completely calm, which scared Emily more than if he had shouted or approached her with accusations. That look spoke louder than any words, he knew, or at least he suspected. Emily instinctively stepped back, her body moving on its own as she tried to keep her composure. She knew she had to disappear, that she couldn't let John catch her here, but her feet seemed glued to the floor. Panic began to flood her mind. How did he end up here? Why had he come to this club? Was he following her? Her eyes darted around the crowd, searching for an escape. At one point, she caught the eyes of her friends, who were laughing by one of the tables, unaware of anything. Her heart raced even faster. She had to do something. She had to leave, now. Emily tried to take another step, but her body refused to cooperate. She feared what would happen next, and the more she tried to pull herself together, the stronger her desire became to simply vanish. But John's gaze held her in place. He took the first step toward her. Her mind screamed, "Run!" She looked around again, searching for a way out, and then she spotted a door on the opposite side of the club, possibly a staff exit. Emily knew she had to take a chance. She spun around sharply, and her legs carried her across the dance floor, away from what could destroy her entire existence. The crowd formed a dense wall around her, and each step was a struggle. The music pounded in her ears, dancing couples blocked her path, forcing her to weave between them. Emily's breathing quickened, becoming ragged, as if she'd been running for a long time. It felt like every eye was on her, but in truth, only one mattered, John's. She risked a glance over her shoulder. John was following her, slowly but steadily closing the distance. His face showed no anger or rage, but in his eyes, there was something she didn't fully understand, a mix of disappointment and pain. It was the look of someone who had just realized that the world they lived in had collapsed. Finally, Emily reached the door. She pushed it open sharply, and the cold night air rushed into the club, as if bringing her back to reality. Outside, darkness awaited, with only neon lights illuminating the narrow alley behind the building. Her body was still shaking, but she stepped out, trying to get as far away from this place as quickly as possible. Leaving behind the roar of the music and the bright lights, Emily felt the tension ease slightly, but the panic still clung to her. She understood that John wouldn't stop here. He wasn't following her for explanations. He wanted the truth. And now she had to either hide or face him. She quickly turned a corner and stopped by a wall, trying to catch her breath and hide in the darkness. But her heart continued to race, and her mind swung between two extremes: confess or keep running. Minutes stretched out slowly, but each one felt endless. Emily listened intently to every sound, hoping John wouldn't pursue her further. She glanced at her phone again. No messages, no calls. And then, suddenly, out of nowhere, she heard footsteps nearby. Emily froze, feeling a cold dread settle inside her. She knew it was John. As if in a dream, she turned her head and saw his silhouette, slowly approaching her down the narrow alley. His face was still calm, but now there was determination in his movements. He came closer and stopped just a few steps away from her. "Are you running?" His voice was quiet, almost calm, but there was a hidden threat in those words. Emily couldn't respond. Her heart was beating so hard, it felt like it would leap out of her chest. All she could do was stare at him, unable to find the words. John slowly took a step forward. His eyes glinted in the dim light, and now Emily saw not only pain but something else. Something that made her feel real fear. "You think I didn't know?" he continued, moving even closer. "That I didn't suspect?" Her voice was paralyzed, but she gathered all her strength to whisper, I can explain everything." But John only smirked, tilting his head slightly. "Explain?" he repeated, his voice just as quiet, but now filled with bitterness. "Was that what you were doing when you ran away from me in the club? Or maybe it was that message you accidentally sent me?" Emily felt the ground slipping from under her. He had seen the message. He knew everything. Her world began to crumble before her eyes. John stood in front of her, the embodiment of her fear, her shame, and her guilt. The words caught in her throat, and she realized she couldn't lie anymore. "John," she finally whispered, trying to hold back tears. "I didn't mean to." "Didn't mean to?" he interrupted, no longer hiding his disappointment. "You didn't mean to, but you still did." Those words hit her harder than she could have expected. Emily covered her face with her hands, trying to hold back the tears, but John didn't stop. "I thought we were honest with each other." His voice grew harsher. "I trusted you. And now what? You just disappear like nothing ever happened?" Emily couldn't find the words. She realized there was no going back now. Everything she had tried to hide was now out in the open. She tried to speak, but her voice broke under the weight of all the emotions overwhelming her. John stood before her, silently watching her despair. He didn't need to say more. Everything was clear. Their life, their marriage, everything they had built together was now in jeopardy. And she knew there was no way to fix it. In the quiet alley, they stood facing each other, both lost in their own thoughts and emotions that defied explanation. Emily understood that from now on, everything had changed. She had betrayed John, and that knowledge would stay with them forever. His gaze remained heavy, and she saw in it not only disappointment but deep pain. That look would haunt her long after he turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the night. Part 7. Consequences. Emily stood alone in the narrow, dark alley, unable to move. John was gone, but his words, his gaze, everything hung in the air like a heavy cloud over her head. She had lost control of everything, the situation, her marriage, herself. Her heart continued to race as if she had just run a long distance, but now it was from the realization that she had lost something invaluable. The silence of the night enveloped her. No messages, no calls. No words to drown out the inner voice screaming at her, "What have you done?" Emily slowly sank to her knees, her shoulders trembling as tears streamed down her cheeks. Pain, disappointment, and guilt blended into a cocktail that made her nauseous. For too long she had kept it all inside, hiding her feelings, her betrayal, her fears. But now there was nothing left to hide. Everything she had built with John was crumbling before her eyes. She needed to do something. To somehow cope with the situation, with the consequences of her actions. But her mind refused to work. She didn't know where to go or what to say. All that remained was the pain. The house was empty. John was nowhere to be found when Emily stumbled into their apartment. She spent several minutes just standing in the hallway, trying to grasp that this was no longer the home where she felt safe. Now it felt foreign, filled with memories of what was and would never be again. Her gaze accidentally fell on a photo on the wall. Her and John smiling on the beach during their last vacation. How simple and happy everything had been then. Tears welled up in her throat again, and Emily turned away with effort. She walked into the bedroom, moving slowly through the apartment that now felt like a stranger's. On the nightstand lay her phone. The screen lit up, one new message. Emily brought the phone closer, feeling panic rise in her chest once more. It was Mike. "What happened? You disappeared. We can't just leave everything like this. Emily read the message several times, unsure how to respond. Mike had been a part of her life for the past few months, but now everything connected to him felt like a lie. It had been a mistake, and she knew that if she continued down this path, she would destroy herself completely. She exhaled, leaving the message unanswered, and collapsed onto the bed. Her thoughts were tangled, and her feelings wouldn't let her be. That night, she was tormented by nightmares, fragments of conversations with John, his gaze, the moment they had met in the club. She would wake up, but find no comfort, fall asleep again, but everything repeated in a loop. The next morning, Emily felt shattered. She had no plan of action. She got up like a robot, made herself coffee, even though she had no desire to drink it. The house was still empty. John hadn't returned, and another wave of panic washed over her. Perhaps this was the end. Perhaps he would never come back. Emily spent several hours in a state of apathy. She couldn't focus on anything. Everything she did felt meaningless. Her thoughts kept returning to the previous evening, the moment she met John, his gaze, every word he had spoken. All of it replayed in her mind over and over, and she felt like she was losing touch with reality. By noon, she couldn't hold back any longer and wrote John a message. "We need to talk." She stared at the screen for a long time, waiting for a reply, but none came. Hours passed before there was a knock at the door. Emily jumped up, feeling her heart start to race again. It was John. She knew it, and she was not ready. But she had to open the door. John stood on the threshold, just as calm as he had been in the club, but there was something new in his eyes, something that made him even more foreign to her. Emily met his gaze, and inside, everything constricted again. "We need to talk." His voice was as cold as his gaze. Emily nodded and stepped aside to let him in. They walked into the living room and sat across from each other. A long, heavy silence fell. Emily wanted to say something, but she didn't know where to begin. "I know everything," John finally said, not breaking eye contact with her. His voice was quiet, but it held a steely edge. "You betrayed me, and now I need to know. Why?" These words struck Emily like a punch to the gut. She knew she wouldn't be able to give him an answer that would fix everything. All she could do was speak the truth that hurt more than any lie. "I can't explain it simply," she began, trying to control the tremor in her voice. "It was something that started happening on its own. I lost control. I didn't want to hurt you." John leaned back on the couch, his eyes filled with disbelief. "You didn't want to?" he asked, shaking his head. "But you did. You chose this path." Emily swallowed hard, feeling tears well up in her eyes again. She couldn't argue with that. Everything John said was true. She chose this path. And now she bore the responsibility for it. "I know," she whispered, lowering her eyes. "I know it's my fault." John continued to stare at her, his gaze growing colder. "So what now?" he asked, crossing his arms over his chest. "Do you want to continue this? Or was it just a fling that went too far?" Emily was ready for this question, but the answer was still painful. She shook her head. "No," she whispered. "It doesn't matter anymore. Mike. He doesn't matter." "Doesn't matter?" John narrowed his eyes, his voice growing colder. "So you're willing to throw it all away just to save us? Or are you saying this because you got caught?" These words were like a knife to her heart. Emily froze, unable to find an answer. John was right. She was ready to end it, not because she realized her mistake, but because everything was now exposed. And that was the most terrible realization for her. The pause stretched out, and John spoke again. "I'm not sure I can forget this. And to be honest, I'm not sure I can forgive you." These words resonated with pain in Emily's chest. She knew she could lose him. And perhaps she had already lost him. "I understand," she said quietly, struggling to hold back tears. "But I'm sorry. I want to try to make things right." John stood up, looking at her with cold determination. Maybe I'm not ready for this conversation yet, he said, heading for the door. I need time. And you need to think about what you want. And with those words he left, leaving Emily alone in the silence of their empty home. Emily remained sitting in the living room, feeling the emptiness growing inside her. Everything had collapsed. And now she was left alone with the consequences of her mistakes. Part 8. The Unpleasant Truth. Emily spent the rest of the day in complete stupor. John was gone, but his words lingered with her, like a heavy burden she couldn't shake off. The silence of the apartment felt unbearable. Each minute stretched infinitely, as if time had slowed down. She couldn't stop thinking about what she had said to John. The conversations replayed in her head over and over, and she couldn't find any justification for herself. Mike sent her another message. Why aren't you answering? Is everything okay? Emily ignored his message again. He no longer mattered, no matter how strange that sounded. All her thoughts were consumed by John and what would happen next. She wanted to be honest, wanted to atone for her guilt, but how? She didn't really know how to fix what she had done. Her feelings for Mike had been a temporary infatuation, something forbidden and dangerous. Now that everything was out in the open, that feeling had vanished, leaving only emptiness and regret. By evening, she was overwhelmed by a sense of loneliness that was so strong she couldn't cope. She needed to distract herself, to do something to stop sinking into endless reflections on the past and future. She dressed and went outside, hoping that a walk would at least bring her back to reality a little. The cold evening air was refreshing, but even that couldn't help her shake off the feeling of anxiety. Emily walked the streets, not noticing the people passing by. She didn't know where she was going, she was just moving forward. Her thoughts kept drifting back to John, to the moment in the club when their eyes met. Everything could have been different if she had just stopped sooner, if she hadn't let her feelings for Mike develop. But now it was too late to regret. She made a choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. When Emily returned home, a message from John popped up on her phone. I'll come over tomorrow evening. We need to continue this conversation. Her heart skipped a beat. Tomorrow evening. He was going to discuss everything again. This meant she still had a chance to explain everything, to try to save their marriage, if that was even possible. But how? What could she say to make John believe her again? The thought that the trust they had built over the years was shattered by one moment of weakness tormented her. And now, even if John decided to give her a second chance, their relationship would never be the same. The next day dragged on painfully slowly, and with each hour, Emily felt her anxiety rising. She tried to occupy herself with household chores, but everything was falling apart. Thoughts of the upcoming conversation with John completely consumed her. Every time she imagined him looking at her again with pain and disappointment, a wave of guilt washed over her. When the clock struck 7 in the evening, she heard the front door open. It was John. He returned, as promised. His steps were slow and confident as he walked into the living room without saying a word. Emily sat on the couch, nervously fiddling with the edge of her sweater. She felt as if she were standing before a verdict. John stopped in front of her, looking straight into her eyes. Have you thought about what you want? He asked, his voice firm but calm. Emily nodded. She tried to gather her thoughts, but everything inside her was trembling. John, she began, her voice quiet but sincere. I don't want to lose you. I made a mistake, and I know it's a huge one. But I really want to make things right. I'm sorry for what I did. I'm sorry I hurt you. John looked at her, but his face remained impassive. Do you understand that this isn't just a mistake? He said after a pause. You betrayed me. You made a choice. I was unimportant to you the moment you chose him. You didn't think about me, about us. Emily knew he was right. But she couldn't find the words to explain why everything happened the way it did. I know I betrayed you, she whispered, and I'm ready to take full responsibility for it. But please, give me a chance to prove I can change. John was silent, pondering her words. His eyes reflected an inner struggle. He didn't want to lose her, but couldn't forget what had happened. Their relationship had always been built on trust, and now that trust was shattered. "I don't know if I can trust you again," he finally said. "I need time, and so do you. We both need to think about whether we can continue this marriage." These words crashed down on her like a heavy weight. Emily understood that this wasn't a rejection. But it wasn't a promise that everything could return to how it was either. John needed time, and she needed patience, which she had never had. "Okay," she whispered, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. "I will wait as long as it takes. I'm sorry, John. I truly am." He nodded, but didn't say anything more. Then, without waiting for further discussion, he headed for the door. "I'll stay with a friend for a while," he said as a farewell. "We both need space." The door closed, and Emily was left alone in the silence. Her heart shattered completely. She knew that now everything depended not only on her. John had to decide whether he could forgive her. And if he couldn't, she would lose him forever. A week passed. John hadn't shown up. Emily texted him, but he replied briefly and distantly, making it clear that he still wasn't ready to communicate. Mike also kept messaging, but she decided to cut all ties with him, realizing she no longer wanted to be in that trap. She sat alone in the empty apartment, feeling life slowly slipping through her fingers. Inside her, there was no longer passion or desire. She was ready to do anything to get John back, but now she understood that not everything was in her hands. Several more days went by, and suddenly Emily received an unexpected message. It was from John. "We need to meet. I've made a decision." Her heart stopped. This could be the end or perhaps a new chance. But she understood that now she would have to accept his decision, whatever it may be. Part 9. The Decision. Emily stared at her phone screen for several minutes, unable to move. John's message felt like a heavy burden on her shoulders. "I have made a decision." These words sounded like a sentence. She understood that there was little she could do now. Everything had already happened, and now she could only wait. Her heart raced as if it were about to leap out of her chest. She didn't know how to behave, how to prepare for this meeting. The silence in the apartment was so profound that she could hear every breath she took, every tick of the clock on the wall. Time seemed to stand still. Emily mindlessly typed a reply, "When and where?" Feeling her fingers tremble, she sent the message. Inside, a storm of emotions raged: fear, pain, hope. But mostly, there was a feeling of uncertainty about whether everything could be fixed. A few minutes later, John replied, "Tonight at our place, at 8. This short response set everything in motion. She would wait for him at home, where their life once began. But now, it was no longer the home they had built together. This place had become cold, foreign, full of memories that felt distant and unattainable. Emily spent the remaining time preparing for the meeting. She tidied up the house, trying to distract herself, but her thoughts kept drifting back to John. What would he say? How could she convince him? Did she even have a chance? By 7:30 p.m., she was ready. Everything around her felt staged, unreal. She put on her best dress and fixed her hair, but in the mirror, she saw not the woman who once was confident in herself and her life. Now it was a different Emily, broken and bewildered, the one who had made a mistake and didn't know how to return to herself. At exactly 8 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Emily flinched. It was John. Her chest tightened with fear and anticipation. She took a deep breath, gathering her last strength, and went to open the door. John stood on the threshold, dressed in dark jeans and a t-shirt, as if they were going for a casual walk. But the expression on his face was serious. He met her gaze, and Emily felt her stomach drop. "Hi," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. "Hi," John replied, entering the apartment. They walked into the living room, and Emily couldn't help but notice how John surveyed the room, as if seeing it for the first time. He sat down on the couch, and she hesitantly stopped opposite him, feeling like a guest in her own home. They remained silent for a long time. The tension in the air was palpable. Finally, John spoke. "I've thought a lot about what happened," he began, his voice calm but cold, "and I needed time to sort out my feelings." Emily remained silent, afraid to interrupt him. Hundreds of questions swirled in her mind, but she didn't know how to ask them. "I'm not going to ask you why you did it," John continued. "We both know that the reason no longer matters. You made a choice, and that speaks for itself. You betrayed me, Emily. And I needed to understand if I could forgive you. Or maybe I just want to leave it all behind." These words pierced her heart like blades. Emily felt her chest constrict with the fear of hearing the final verdict. She tried to keep her composure, but inside, everything was trembling. "And what have you decided?" she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. John lowered his gaze for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts, then looked at her again, and in his eyes, pain flickered, a pain he tried to hide but couldn't. "I've decided that we should part ways," he said quietly. These words echoed in her head. Everything around her seemed to freeze. Emily felt as if the world was collapsing beneath her. She knew this was a possibility, but she hadn't expected the end to come so suddenly. "Are you serious?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You want to leave us?" John sighed, slumping his shoulders. "I don't want to do this, but I don't see another way out. I've tried to imagine how I could trust you again. But every time I think about it, I see you with him. It tears me apart inside, Emily. I can't live like this anymore. And I don't think you can turn everything back to the way it was." Emily covered her face with her hands, feeling tears streaming down her cheeks. She tried to find the words, but they wouldn't come. Inside her, the pain ripped apart in a way she couldn't express. "I'm sorry," she said, sobbing. "I really don't know what to say. I didn't want it to end like this." John watched her, but there was no anger in his eyes, just disappointment and bitterness. "I know," he replied quietly. "But sometimes, it's the only way. We both need time to heal. And maybe someday we can forgive each other. But right now, I'm not ready." Emily knew that arguing was pointless. She could plead with him to give her a second chance, but she understood that John had already made his decision. "I love you, John," she whispered, lowering her head. "And I will always love you." John smiled sadly, looking at her with sorrow. "I love you too, but love doesn't always save relationships." These words were the final blow. Emily sat still as John got up and walked toward the door. He paused at the threshold, turned around, and looked at her one last time, as if he wanted to say something but remained silent. Then he stepped outside, leaving her alone in the empty, quiet house. Emily sat for a long time, motionless. Everything she had was gone in one night. She was left alone, with a broken heart and the feeling that everything she knew about herself and her life no longer made sense. Weeks passed. Emily gradually grew accustomed to the loneliness. She tried to return to a normal life, went to work, met friends, but inside, there was always emptiness. John no longer wrote. He seemed to have vanished from her life, leaving only memories of what once was. One day, passing by the old club where it all began, she stopped. Memories flooded back with renewed strength. She recalled that evening when she first met Mike. Everything had seemed so alluring then, flirting, passion, play. But now she understood that beneath it all lay a deep abyss into which she had thrown herself. She closed her eyes, trying to erase that memory. But it was a part of her life, a part of her mistakes that she had to accept. Emily never saw Mike again. He too remained in the past, a painful reminder of how easily one could lose what truly mattered. A new chapter of her life opened, but now she knew that trust and love were the most fragile things in the world. And sometimes, one misstep could destroy everything that seemed eternal. Part 10. the memories left behind. A month had passed since the evening John left, leaving Emily alone in the empty house. The first weeks were torturous for her. She woke up to a silence that only intensified her inner pain. Each morning began with memories of John, their shared breakfasts, conversations, laughter. Now all of it felt distant, like the life of another person. Emily tried to fill the void. She returned to work and spent more time with friends, but nothing could compensate for what she had lost. Her life turned into a monotonous stream of days with no room for joy. Even the things that once brought her pleasure now seemed meaningless. One evening, after work, she sat by the window, holding a glass of wine, and thinking about how her life could have been if she hadn't made that fateful choice. She understood that this moment had to come sooner or later. Her relationship with John had not been as perfect as it seemed at first glance. They had both missed the moment when they needed to stop and talk, to try to resolve their issues. Instead, she had sought comfort in the arms of another man. The evening she accidentally sent the message to John changed everything. It was the beginning of the end, although she hadn't realized it then. Now she understood that she had lost not just her husband, but a part of herself. That part which had believed in love, trust, and fidelity. A few days after John finally left, Emily received a message from him. It was brief and cold, yet still from him. "I've moved into a new apartment. Let's split our things. I don't need much. Keep whatever you want." This message was the final blow. Dividing their possessions felt like a symbol of the definitive break in their lives. She knew that they could never go back. John had begun a new life, and she had to do the same, no matter how difficult it might be. Emily agreed to meet with him to discuss the details. Inside her, a small hope still lingered. Tiny, barely noticeable, but it was there. Perhaps this meeting would provide an opportunity for another conversation, an attempt to fix everything. But she understood that it was just an illusion she clung to, afraid to let go. They met at the cafe on the corner where they once loved to spend time together. The place that had once been filled with so much joy and laughter now felt cold and empty. Emily arrived early to gather her thoughts and prepare for the meeting. When John entered, her heart skipped a beat. He looked calm and confident, as if nothing had happened. "Hi," he said, sitting across from her. His voice was steady, but a shadow of pain still lingered in his eyes. "Hi," Emily replied, trying to maintain her composure. They ordered coffee and sat in awkward silence for a few minutes. Emily struggled to find the words to start the conversation, fearing to hear something that would completely shatter her world. "How are you?" she finally asked, unsure how else to begin. John shrugged. "Fine, trying to start over. And you?" "Same," she replied shortly. They fell silent again. Emily realized they had nothing left to say to each other. All the previous closeness had vanished, as if it had never existed. The person sitting before her was not the one she had once loved. This was a stranger, someone she had hurt and lost. "I think we should discuss how we'll divide our things," John said, breaking the silence. His tone was businesslike, as if they were discussing ordinary household matters, not the destruction of their lives. Emily nodded, trying not to show how deeply this indifference hurt her. "Of course," she said quietly. They went over all the details. Who would take the furniture, who would keep the car. At one point, Emily caught herself thinking that all of this felt surreal. They sat like two strangers dividing their past life, as if it were just a project that hadn't been completed. When they finished discussing, John looked at her, and for a moment, the feelings they once shared flickered in his eyes again. Emily saw the pain he had been trying so hard to hide. "I don't hold anything against you, Emily," he said unexpectedly. "I just want you to be happy, even if it's not with me." These words struck her harder than she could have imagined. She struggled to find a response, but the words stuck in her throat. She didn't know what to say. Inside her, everything was a tangle of pain, regret, and guilt. But perhaps those were the very words she needed to hear. John stood up, preparing to leave. "If you need anything, you know how to reach me," he said, and without waiting for a reply, headed for the exit. Emily watched him go, feeling the last threads of their shared life snap. She didn't know what would happen next, but she understood that now she had to start over from scratch. And this journey would have to be taken alone. A few days later, while cleaning her apartment, Emily stumbled upon an old photograph. It showed her and John young and happy at a friend's party. She held it in her hands, remembering the moment when they still believed in their future. Those memories were so bright and warm that for a moment, she felt like a part of that old life again. But the photograph was just a memory. Now she was ready to let go of the past and start living again. Emily placed the photo back in the box and closed it. All that remained were her memories. But she knew that sooner or later the pain would subside, and something new would take its place. Maybe one day, she would be able to believe in love again. But that would be another story. What would you do if you were caught in the act of betrayal right in the heat of passion? Share your version of the ending in the comments.